Okay, so our next speaker is Clara Petruzzi, who's a composer and holds a PhD in musicology, studied here in University of Helsinki, and she'll be talking about Aurinko, a band or a group that the name translates as The Sun, a Latin American art music group. And yes, please, let's go on.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Aurinko started in 2010 and was founded by an association called also Aurinko that was founded in 2009, and its aim was to promote the performance of Latin American art music and also of research and composing and it's like a case of multicultural work, and I'm involved in it as a viola player, as you can see there, and also as a composer and also as organizer and every kind of ways, coffee, cooking and grants and so on. I think we maybe fall in that category of that small avant-garde work where there is no people listening usually. But anyway, I think we are working with multiculturalism in many levels. First, Latin American art music in itself is multicultural since its very existence, because it's the product of colonialism in some way. Then we are based in Finland, and so our musicians are both Latin American and Finnish art music musicians. And then the repertoire we play in a global sense, if we think about global art music scene, is very marginal. So we are dealing with multicultural issues both in the Latin American countries where composers are working, and how the works are created and why, and also with reception in their own countries and here in Finland, what kind of public we have, why are we working here, and then in the global, in the world scene, what kind of sense has to do this work. And then I like to link this to the theme of the symposium about beliefs. I think beliefs have been influencing Latin American music and are still influencing it. In many ways there are some important beliefs that are still active also before also after political independence has been achieved in the region. So we are a quite small group because we are working with project grants, basically. We don't have permanent support, financial support. And we are a flexible group, so we do quartets and we do quintets and duos and so on. The first belief that shaped the emerging of what is today considered Latin American art music, of course it wasn't then considered art music. This concept is newer. It's about Christianity, religion, so the belief that European religion is the good one, and native religions are pagan, and native instruments, dances, and rituals, of course, were banned many times as pagans. Some traits were tolerated, and music was also used as a vehicle for colonization, and this belief was, of course, imposed by violence, but then religion was adopted through syncretism, and also this had this happened in music too, because music was in both religions, native religions, and so I can't go there. Where this is an example where local language and music so that was Renaissance music in Quechua language, with a very native poetic about God and nature. So that's very old. It's 1631 written. The other belief was that European culture is the bearer of civilization, and that native culture is something inferior that has to be better to get to the level of European. And this included, of course, not only music but also clothing and food and language, aesthetic, cultural practices. So then civilization was imitating European culture. Still, of course, cultural resistance continued, both openly and in concealed ways. For example, dramatic dances that were taking places in all towns and still are taking places. But in the cities, religious and theater music followed very strictly European models. So we have, for example, Baroque music that is in anything like European music, but we have also these mixed forms. I think I will skip the examples because it's quite takes much time to go to the internet. So Latin American elites inherited the power after independence wars, and they inherited these beliefs and used them, continuing acting and perpetuating these beliefs because they were a means to perpetuate their own power. So this opportunity of political independence to incorporate other groups of the society, like Afro-Americans or Native, to sharing the power with them was lost. So internalizing this concept of European art is better. Latin Americans formed in Western art music tradition had to fight against this belief that was kind of a permanent inferiority complex, because they had this necessity of reaffirming their own identity as musicians, Western art music musicians, composers or public, and at the same time had internalized this being the other that never can reach the perfection of European art. So in 1800, there were mostly European visiting composers that started, for example, to incorporate native subjects to compositions, and not Americans themselves. But this process of recovering their own musical history and identity and the freedom to create has been a long one, but a very fascinating one, and is still, I think it's still happening. This process is shown in the musical works that have been composed during the past centuries. And interesting in this multiculturalism is that these works are mostly unknown, are maybe known in the paper, in research, but are not played and not heard. Mostly unknown in Latin America and possibly totally unknown to the rest of the world. And so one of our objectives, aims, objectives, and purposes as a group is to play this kind of music, research of recording, of course. Beginning the 20th century, native music was increasingly researched, and also musical elements began to enter in art music composition. And a current called indigenismo tried to give value to native heritage, not in this case, for example, to Afro-Peruvian or Afro-American heritage, but it was mainly practiced by white people speaking Spanish and living in the cities, and then it was quite of paternalistic still, but it was like the next step to take contact. One example is this zarzuela is very known. One piece of it, it's a zarzuela called El Cóndor Pasa, which has been recorded by Simon and Garfunkel and many others. But it's actually a music theater piece, play, and it's very funny, but its plot is anti-colonialist, so it's anti-imperialist. It tells about people that are rebelling against the mining company of the U.S. that are there in Peru somewhere. Salon music in the cities was another important link between art music, European art music tradition, the beginning of the art music tradition in these countries, and local popular music and native music, and all these were also meeting in the salons of the citizens in the cities. Piano and guitar music mainly were very important. Also singing, where the main instruments were these composers fusioned local music with art music composition and began writing it, for example. And then after the Second World War, I think it's like a frontier with the modern music life in many Latin American countries, but it of course depends on every country. That Chile, Argentina, and Peru, Bolivia, Mexico have different histories, but mainly we can see some that after 1950, for example, most of the countries have their own art music institutions where this tradition is supported by the government. We have conservatoires, we have symphony orchestras, and paid by the state, and shown as an official way to educate musicians, for example. This has to do with what Elina said also. In many cases, conservatoires did not take other musics than European art music at all. So musicians formed there were looking to Europe, and in many cases old European music, but that composers anyway were all the time in contact with other music. So it's like a kind of schizophrenic being, I think, because at the same time it is ignored, and at the same time it is present, exists. Modernism in Latin America is different than in Europe in many senses, because in Europe after World War it has a very international character. They reject nationalism because it has to do with fascism and these things. But in Latin American music, art music, modernism is more like looking for what is the own roots, but not in a folklorist, exotic way, but in a way that goes into the authentic. And sometimes not even with quotes, you cannot hear it, but it's present in the thinking of the composers. While postmodern era has brought this migration and mobility issues, and so we have to face the fact that many Latin American composers today are living abroad and working abroad because they don't have the same conditions for working in their local countries. But still, this Latin American, like Elina said, Latin America is a construction, of course. It's not something real. At the same time, it is something real, since there are people that are relating to that and thinking of it like something they can identify with. Of course, it has many levels and many problems, and one of them is what Elina also mentioned, that is it a brand to sell the music like we play Latin American music, and use the stereotypes that come with it, or is it something different? For example, many composers they can incorporate, for example, native instruments today, and I think there are many things that make it different in many musical ways that are worth showing. So, as a Finnish group, we have to face this kind of ideas in how we present our work. We have some funding, both as a national group and both as a multicultural work group. I think we are our public is, of course, Finnish public. Also, it is Latin Americans living in Finland. Also, we are working with composers from Latin America living here, and also with composers living there who can then play their music here, and for them it is very important. We were in Colombia this year, and we played new music by Colombian composers. Very, very difficult pieces. We had to rehearse them many months, and then we premiered them here and also there, and it was like, for the media there, we had a very big media covering in Colombia. It was for them very surprising that a Finnish group is playing Colombian music. So that was the main thing that was marvelous to them. They want to play our music. So I think it was challenging somehow this belief that what is Latin American could not be interesting in Europe, because the usual figure is that musicians in Latin America know very well what is happening in art music in Europe. They can play the works and they know the names and they follow what is going on. But when you ask here a musician, do you know some Latin American composers? Then I think mostly guitar players know, but other people don't know. Or maybe they know Piazzolla, or one or two more, but it's usually very little known. So we are like marginal inside a marginal, because art music, and then Latin American art music, and then but I think what we can give to the world, in a sense, of course, is this huge repertoire that is still to discover and recover. There are thousands of works, of art music works, lying somewhere in archives or in houses. And of course there has been some discoverings, for example in Bolivia, in the Jesuit missions of Chiquitos and Mojos, where there's a Baroque music treasure being discovered. But I think there is much more. And it's like part of the whole Western art music heritage. So it's like recovering part of all European musicians' repertoire. And I have noticed that musicians also we are few and we are friends, and still there are some, when we work together, there are some working culture differences that where we can learn from each other. And also when you play for different publics and the same music you play it in Latin America or here, it has a very different reception. What people hear is different. I don't remember, maybe I can take one more example, so just to... Okay, I wanted to show that because it's a typical example of what is not maybe considered typical Latin American, like sexy and lively music and so. But this is still a Colombian young woman composer that is working with actually with black music tradition in the Pacific coast, and she derives her inspiration from that. So maybe you cannot hear that there, but it's still there. And okay, I think we are running with time, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, if there's any brief questions, comments, we can have one. Otherwise, we need to move on. Okay, right. Okay, and then our next speaker is Thomas Hilde.